Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Wanted to thank first QED and Academy by Rima One for organizing this series of webinar. This is the third of the webinar. It will be the last one. We will be talking today about AOL, a big question that has been a big question for a long time, and it's there's new areas of AOL that we try to explore today with the new AACSB 2020 standards. So Joanne will be our expert today. Thank you, Joanne, for joining us. And we have Sarah Isabel Marin Zapata from EAFIT in Colombia. Thank you for waking up early, Sarah. Sarah is the International Accreditation Coordinator for the business school. And we have Venkat Yanamandram from Wollongong in Australia, who is Associate Dean International and Accreditation. Thank you, Venkat, for staying up late because it's 11 p.m. for you right now in Australia. So thank you, the two of you, for joining us today. Just two little things before we get going. So this event is to hear about the expertise of Joanne and the vision of Venkat and Sarah on AOL and their vision of the process. And we want it to be as interactive as possible. So I will be monitoring the chat, I'll be monitoring the Q&A, and I will interrupt Joanne, who speaks a lot, when there is something interesting, and I will push your question. So Joanne, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate that. So we'll just share the screen. Give me one sec. Okay, so the last couple of weeks, what we've done is we've started off by looking at, and I'm just going to, my screen is playing silly beggars. There we go. We started off by looking at the fact that the 2020 standards are grouped into 3 sections. And in the first 2 webinars, we referred mostly to the first group of standards around strategic management and innovation. So today, as Ben said, we're going to turn our attention to the second group, and in particular, Standard 5 on assurance of learning. And within the 2020 standards, Standard 5 includes much of what was held under 2013 within Standard 8 around AOL, Standard 11 around degree program equivalence and educational level, and then Standard 14 on executive education. Now, the one thing I will say is that Standard 8 under the 2013 standards also dealt with curriculum management, and that's moved into its own standard under 2020, Standard 4. So when we're talking about the kind of similarities between Standard 8 under 2013 and Standard 5 under 2020, we're very much referring to assurance of learning and that particular process. Now, over the last couple of weeks, and we've been talking about the 2020 standards, I've referred over and over again to this idea about them being principles-based framework. And one of the things I always find useful when I stand back and I look at a standard is to think about, what is the standard really all about? What's the key question around the standard? So for example, last week we were looking at Standard 3 around faculty and professional staff resources. And the key question there is probably something like, you know, do I have appropriate and sufficient faculty and staff resources to support my mission? So what I'd like you to do now is to just take a moment, and in the chat box, I want you to think, what do you think is the key question being asked when in a standard that talks about, you know, AOL and assurance of learning? And if you just want to use the chat box to actually share what you think that would be absolutely brilliant. So what do you think is the key question, the key point of Standard 5? What question is it trying to get your school to answer? So just take a moment and we'll ask everybody just to add in what they think.
And if we don't have a question, I will have to just point finger. Oh, well, we already have Alex from Maastricht. Have the program objective been achieved? Is the first question. Tobin, are learners getting what they need to be successful?
Great answers.
Colleen, are my process sufficient to assure learner success within the program? Linda, can we end on heart say that students achieve the program competencies and learning outcomes? Sally, to assure ourselves that our students are meeting the program outcomes. Louise, It is asking how we can be sure that students have achieved the intended learning outcomes. Siriwood, have we delivered as we promised? Rodrigo, have you really developed a system for continuous improvement? Sally, continuous improvement. Valerie, how does the school ensure that learners get competencies, plus how program evolve based on direct and indirect survey and measures, and Bethan, outcomes achieved? That's where we are now, Joanne.
That sounds pretty good. And there's a lot there that makes a lot of sense. And a lot of those tie in with what I would see as the key question, which essentially says, are the school's educational programs fit for purpose? So have the competencies been achieved? And all of those things that we saw coming through there in the answers. Some really, really good answers, actually. So thank you very much. Now, the important thing to remember about Standard 5 is that AACSB does differentiate between degree and non-degree programs. But when I say fit for purpose, I think overall what we mean is, do students graduate from programs with the expected knowledge, skills, and abilities that they need? And are these the appropriate knowledge, skills, and abilities required to prepare learners for careers of future study? And I think AOL is always one of those standards where it can be really tempting to take a compliance-based approach, because it is one of those ones that it's quite process-driven, and sometimes schools just want to get it done. But it's also a standard that really offers a great opportunity to reflect on what are the most important attributes for graduates, in line with the mission and the vision and the strategy of the school. And then to have a system that evaluates whether your educational programs, be it executive education, degree programs, or whatever, are delivering on those attributes. Now, when I say executive education, we're not talking about a big formal AOL process. We're talking about a more general quality assurance. But the standard does cover both executive education and degree programs. So it's important to remember that both of them are covered. So very quickly, I'm just going to quickly jump to the accreditation principles and how these matter and how they're relevant to Standard 5. So as we said, the journey matters. With AACSB Business Schools, you're encouraged to hold yourselves accountable for improving business practice. So it's a system of continuous improvement. So in the context of Standard 5, this is all about the impact of quality assurance on your curriculum and your processes and your educational offerings. So what impact is your quality assurance process having, and is it driving continuous improvement? And what kind of changes are going to be happening over the next few years? Within the triangle of excellence, again, we're coming back to the need for the kind of intersection between academic and professional engagement and using that to drive excellence. So in the context of Standard 5, is your assurance of learning process helping you to determine whether the links between degree programs, executive education, practice engagement, research and intellectual contributions, are these all serving high quality learning outcomes and continuous improvement? And finally, of course, everything connects. Mission and strategy continue to be at the center of everything and should provide a clear and cohesive link between your activities and actions. And your AOL process should be helping you to ensure that. Over the first of our 3 webinars, we did cover a general overview of the changes within AACSB. And we'll actually touch on a lot of those points again today, but obviously the focus today will really be around assurance of learning. Now, in previous weeks, I've always started by talking about the importance of recognizing the things that have stayed the same. Over the last couple of months, since the 2020 standards have been issued, AOL and the areas within Standard 5 are probably the areas where I've heard the most misinterpretation and misunderstandings. And a lot of those, surprisingly, were not around where the changes are, but around the similarities. Excuse me. So today what I'm going to do is just spend a few minutes longer than normal talking about the similarity areas and making sure that there's no misconceptions and misunderstandings there. The key point I would say is that when it comes to Standard 5, there are far more similarities between the 2013 and the 2020 standards than there are differences. And that's probably key and important. So the first area to look at is executive education. So there's no change in expectation for executive education. It's been embedded into Standard 5, but the focus is pretty much the same as it was under the 2013 standards. It's ensuring that there's an appropriate system of quality assurance around all of your executive education programs. And typically that's measured by things like client satisfaction, repeat business, general quality assurance processes that are in place, good system for reviewing your programs that they're delivering what you want. And I tend to refer to this as informal AOL or general quality assurance because it's less structured and less detailed than the kind of AOL process that's more synonymous with AACSB. And of course, as with 2013 standards, it's usually only necessary to include executive education if it represents over 5% of your annual resources or if it's strategically significant. And that hasn't changed from 2013. The next area I want to just consider quickly is collaborative partnerships. AOL expectations remain the same for any collaborative programs that come into scope. So if you've got a program with a collaborative partner and it falls into scope, then you have to complete an AOL on that program, the same as you would on any other program. Now, the one thing I would say here is that there is more clarity on the scope of collaborative partnerships. And we covered this back in webinar 1. So as a quick reminder, AACSB has provided a useful table, and I think it's on page 14. Yeah, page 14 of the 2020 standards. And it defines the various types of collaborative provision, collaborative partnerships, and whether they're inside or outside of scope. So if they're in scope, you include them on your faculty tables and you include your full AOL process, full formal AOL. Now, the principles haven't changed, but there was, I think, previously quite a bit of confusion and some inconsistency in the treatment of programs. So one of the things that we recommend is that every school takes the time to look at this table and to map its own collaborative programs against the definitions, just to double check and determine scope. And there's 2 key points I would say here. The first is, and we've said it over and over again, it's important to read the AACSB definitions because terms like franchise, validation, dual degree, double degree can mean different things in different schools or different regions or different countries. So in the context of AACSB, you need to look at the definition as AACSB defines it. And they're all in that table on page 14. The second thing is just a quick reminder that something doesn't need to be overseas to be a collaborative partnership. I was recently with a school who at a very late stage in the process suddenly referred to a regional college that they had a partnership with that they'd somehow kind of forgotten about in terms of AOL because they were so focused on international programs. So obviously a collaborative partnership can equally exist locally or regionally. It doesn't have to be overseas. But again, none of that has changed between 2013 and 2020. The next thing I would say that AOL as a formal detailed process remains focused on degree level programs. So it's degree level competencies. And this again hasn't changed from 2013. AOL has always required schools to really consider whether programs are delivering the required degree level objectives. And just as a reminder, this includes stackable micro credentials. So if you've got a series of micro credentials, be it certificates, diplomas, or other forms of modules, that can be stacked together and could lead to a degree award. Then these are considered stackable micro credentials and you're required to complete an AOL process on them. If you have other forms of credentials or certificates or diplomas that could not become part of a degree, then it's just like any other executive education provision. It's a general quality assurance process. And I think Venkat might have some additional points on that we'll come back to in a couple of minutes. One of the comments I've heard over the last couple of weeks was somebody quite significantly talking about a reduction in faculty involvement in AACSB. And I was kind of going, because this is not correct. I mean, if you think about it, assurance of learning by its very nature relies on the involvement and the expertise of faculty. And even within the AACSB supporting documents, the interpretive guidance states it very clearly. It says something like AOL should be faculty driven and that it requires the majority of faculty involved at some level. I mean, the whole objective of assurance of learning is to confirm that programs deliver on intended outcomes. And I mean, that's obviously going to require the support and the input of faculty. Now, faculty who are directly involved in areas where there's going to be measurement points are likely to be more deeply involved, absolutely. But it's important that all faculty are aware of what the competencies are going to be, the learning objectives, that they're involved in the feedback and the review, and that they contribute to the continuous improvement process. So just to be clear that that has not changed. And if anything, I think AACSB probably expects to see that even more strongly in the current system, because it speaks to the heart of the principles behind AOL. And then finally, the language around measuring and closing the loop. Now, Stephanie Bryant in AACSB has done quite a lot in the last few years to clarify language that's used around AOL, particularly the language around closing the loop. And I mean, just to be clear, closing the loop refers to when you show how your actions or improvements that you've put in place have affected student learning outcomes and whether they've had the desired impact. And expectations here haven't changed. AACSB doesn't prescribe strictly the number of times a competency or a learning outcome needs to be measured, but it clearly outlines an expectation that it's twice in a 5-year period. Schools might look, if there was a particular issue or a particular reason, to do it more often. More often doesn't make it better, but if you had a particular issue, you might choose to review it more often. But I think doing it only once in a 5-year period, that doesn't really stack up as a rigorous, process of continuous improvement. 5 years is a long time, and you'd expect to see, and I would expect to see every school measure the learning outcomes at least twice in a 5-year period. And where they're required to put in actions, to look at whether those actions have had the desired impact on the second measurement. So before we go on and start looking at any changes or anything else, just if Venkat or Zara wants to jump in, or Ben, if there's been any questions, it might be a good point to take them.
So far, no question, Joanne.
Grand. Venkat or Zara, do you want to add anything?
The only thing that I would add, Joanne, is about the faculty-driven process. In fact, as you say, in 2013, it was actually implicit. But in 2020, there is an explicit expectation that there would be faculty involvement. And I always say, imagine the analogy of people, waiting and getting into a bus. You might have a few people inside a bus sitting close to each other and having some conversations. You might have a few people outside the bus waiting, and a few people figuring out whether to get into the bus at all. Yeah. In an AOL bus, so as to speak, you ideally want a significant number of stakeholders inside the bus, having those meaningful conversations on teaching, learning, and assessment, right? And that's what the AOL principle is all about. Take your people in your journey in the AOL process. When you implement the learning goals, when you have your curriculum map, when you have your measures, when you collect the data, when you engage in the analysis of the data, and when you close the loop. Okay. Happy to expand if you have more questions.
Okay, I would like to add to that assurance of learning and continuous improvement is about creating culture. And to create the culture of assessment, the culture of continuous improvement, you need to have everyone involved in that AOL bus that Venkat is talking about. So, so it's very important that everyone sees the role they have in the assurance of learning in each of the steps of the process. Either it can be collecting, but I think there's more power in reflecting on the results, reflecting on the outcomes, reflecting on what can we do, what we can improve to enhance, to help students in their process. So it's all about culture. So that's why it's very important to have a faculty on board always.
Thank you very much.
Venkat, maybe you should change the bus analogy in COVID time, you know, a bus, a COVID-friendly environment.
That's a good point.
Socially distanced, of course.
Okay, so I'll just take it back then and start looking at what are the changes that we've seen. So,
Joanne, just one question that just popped up.
Yeah, sure thing.
It's really easy to answer for you. I was under the impression that AOL data must be collected annually and that the loop must be closed effectively every year. Is this not correct?
No, that's not strictly correct. Some schools choose to do that, but it doesn't necessarily make it a better or worse AOL process. AACSB expects to see the loop is closed, so 2 measurements effectively in a 5-year period. You know, if a school wants to do more, it's absolutely free to, but it doesn't need to. What I see, because obviously most of the schools I see are in the early process, and in the early stages of AACSB, schools are trying to establish their AOL process, so they tend to measure more often because they want to get to a stage where they've measured every competency in every program twice, so that they can be considered to have a full AOL in place.
Venkat?
I don't know if Venkat or Zara want to add to that.
Yeah, just Joanne, just to add to what you were saying, I agree with you that it's not compulsory to collect the data every year, but just think about the kind of interventions you have. Sometimes the interventions may be within the control of what we call it as within the unit coordinator, right? Sometimes it might be having to go to the program teaching team, in which case it takes time for the agreement on interventions to implement the interventions and then to collect the data to see if the interventions that you have implemented are actually working, right? Now, you need to have some kind of diagnostic data to see if they do work. If they don't, have your plan B, in which case you have to collect more than once or even more than twice, right? So it really, really depends upon the kind of knowledge gap or the competency gap that AACSB is talking about, and then you take it from there. For us, we do it at 3 levels. One that is within the unit, so the control of the unit coordinator, which we call it as a short term. The second one is within the control of the program teaching team. And the third one are really the structural changes to entry requirements, changes to the actual program, you know, changing the number of subjects, the design of the subjects, and these take quite a long time. So depending upon the nature of the intervention and the complexities involved, you might be able to collect the data more regularly or less often.
Sarah, do you want to add something? You're muted.
Yes, so I would just add that, as Joanne was saying, since, for example, in my school, we are in the initial accreditation process, so we needed to establish a systematic process, so that's why we made it annually. But it was because we needed to get everyone on board, to have a schedule, to have it prepared, and then we are having the time to reflect on those results and on those interventions that Venkat is talking about. So it's about having the system in place, but having a meaningful system that helps the school to make those interventions to help students.
Maybe a question that is related by Pauline at the same time. How about students' involvement? Some national standards also oblige to communicate competencies reference scheme to students, but sometimes may be different from AOL.
I would say that's a choice of the school, but Venkat or Zara might have a different perspective.
So is it the one where the national frameworks overlap?
No,
with
it's
no,
involving students in your AOL
AOL
process.
So we do.
Okay,
We do. Okay, I'm sorry. So
No, go ahead, Sarah.
okay, so we do it at the point in which we are reflecting on the outcomes, reflecting on the analysis of the results, the AOL results. So we have some students that are leaders. The leaders they are chosen by students, so they participate in discussions about the results. And we are planning to communicate the AOL expectations in the curriculum with them. So I think for having this culture on AOL, it's important to have all the stakeholders informed. So at some point, the school might need to do that.
Ben, can I just add an example? I was just thinking about when Sarah was talking about leadership. Is that okay? Do you have a minute or two?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay. So when I was teaching into the MBA program, we've had an instance where we have a learning outcome or a learning goal around students being reflective practitioners. So in one of the presentations, we had a situation where the student was actually quite defensive in getting feedback. So at the end of the presentation, we actually asked the student, what's going on, because one of the marking criteria is how they act upon the feedback to respond to the presentation. And that particular student was talking about being in a particular industry, the manufacturing, the construction industry. And for him, it was all about being mature. And for him, the mature was that he had to defend his ideas. So that really got us thinking that what is responsible leadership, right? And that fed into our curriculum review process, which then actually became one of our recurring themes about MBA being a responsible leadership, and what we do in terms of the curriculum to teach what responsible leadership is for our cohort of students. So going back to the example of the student involvement, certainly we take the marking rubrics and use that as a measure in figuring out what is the kind of competency gaps. But there are also these kind of qualitative feedback that we do get from students, which triggers the other processes for curriculum improvements.
Thank you, Venkat.
Okay. We okay to continue?
Well, last question to Venkat then, because there is a question from Susanna who is linked. So can we use the student satisfaction surveys?
You certainly can, and these are indirect measures. And I think Joanne was talking about the use of both the direct and indirect measures. And in the 2020 standards, indirect measures can be as good as the direct measures, as long as the direct measures are also being used in some programs for assurance of learning purposes. So if you've got satisfaction surveys, and if you've got feedback from alumni, if you've got feedback from students who have returned from internships, certainly make use of that as part of your assurance of learning.
And Venkat's right. We're going to bring that up as part of the changes, because now you're getting into where the changes are.
And one last question from Susanna again. Is it considered student involvement?
Does it matter?
Yeah.
Just a question.
Yeah.
Joanne, you have the floor.
I don't know if it matters, to be honest. It could be. Yeah, it could be, but I think it depends how you define that yourself. Okay. Sorry, just sharing. Okay, we're back on screen?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, so just let's go through the changes. So the first thing I said we're going to mention was the language changes, and there's been several amendments to terminology throughout the 2020 standards, and two are particularly relevant to Standard 5, one being around student versus learner and the other being around learning goals versus competencies. So instead of referring to students, the 2020 standard really takes on this principle of lifelong learning. And I don't think there's any references left to students. All the references are around this concept of learners, and really just getting the sense of a learning mindset and a transferable skill of learning. And then the second is around competencies, which I mentioned last week as well. And this is the term that's being used instead of learning goals within the context of standards like Standard 5. Now, just to reinforce again, back to that point, it's important to read the definitions within the standards. So when AACSB refers to competencies, it broadly means that this is the knowledge skills, and abilities expected. And that's important to recognize, because I'm very aware that within some contexts, particularly I would see it in Europe, when people talk about competencies, they're really talking about a professional context, and they're looking at skills that are being demonstrated within a workplace environment. And they would tend to use learning objectives to describe the kind of more academic perspective of those. But in the context of AACSB, when they talk about competencies, they are talking about broadly knowledge, skills, and abilities expected. So that's what it means. The 2020 standards now include a table, Table 5.1, which has been around previously in various versions, but not necessarily compulsory. Table 5.1 is now required for schools in the initial accreditation process, and it is optional for schools that are in a CIR process or a continuous review process. And essentially all Table 5.1 is, it's designed to be an easy way to provide an overview of your AOL system. So in other words, it includes information that's always been required, such as what is the competency, what's the benchmark required, how are you going to measure it, when and where are you going to measure it, what are the results, have you had any actions arising from those results, and then what's the second measurement. And schools are expected to complete Table 5.1 for every program. So if you have 10 programs, you'll have 10 versions of 5.1, 20 programs, 20 versions of Table 5.1. And just to say, there's a sample of a completed table. It's a simple one, but there is a sample of a completed table in the interpretive guidance document. So just that's worth having a look at. But again, it's only required for initial review, and it's optional for any ongoing reviews. The reason behind optional for ongoing reviews is a lot of schools that are established within their AACSB accreditation already have dashboards and displays for giving this information. And AACSB is saying basically, if you've already got a process to display this that you're happy with, where you can stick with that. But if you're starting, we'd like it in this format. This is the point that came up in one of the great questions that we got around direct and indirect measures.
So,
yeah.
One question on Table 5.1 from...
Sure.
Table 5.1 for joint/combined degrees.
For joint/combined degrees? Yeah. So I'm immediately, of course, going to my page 14 just to check joint/combined degrees. So joint degrees, I first would look at as seen within scope. And yes, because your AOL process is required, it's in scope, therefore full AOL is required, therefore you have to complete Table 5.1. So again, if a program is in scope, you're doing a full AOL, and if you're doing a full AOL and you're in the initial process, you're completing a Table 5.1 for that degree.
Thank you.
So thanks, Ben. So direct and indirect measures, 2013 standards allowed scope for both direct and indirect measures, but the focus was always on direct measures, and there was an expectation that every learning objective or learning goal within the 2013 regime would have a direct measure attached and might have a supporting indirect measure occasionally. Under 2020, there's a modified approach where AACSB is kind of sitting back and saying, well, actually, you know what? Perhaps sometimes it is more appropriate to have an indirect measure, depending on what it is, the competency you're trying to measure and you're trying to look at. So it's saying that the choice of direct versus indirect measures is very much up to the school, and it should be congruent with your mission and your strategic initiatives. So, to take a couple of examples, a lot of schools have oral communication or presentation skills included within their learning objectives traditionally. And I would expect to see some of those included within competencies going forward. So traditionally, a school might decide that the attainment, applying a rubrics to whether a student had attained the skill was best done through some kind of presentation, in-class presentation or oral defense of a project or something like that. And it would have, a formal rubrics very direct measure, and it would go through it in the normal way. Under 2020, a school might decide to go for indirect feedback from employers based on internships or other work experience modules. So they might, go and ask employers or those that have supported internships, by and large, do you think our graduates or our students have good, satisfactory oral competency skills? And they might use an indirect measure. Similarly, you might see something around preparedness to work in an international environment. You quite often see that. And rather than trying to come up with a direct measure that's based on a module or a program or a case study that they've done within the program, schools might now look at something like a postgraduate survey outcome, looking at, for example, the number of graduates working in international environments, or looking at regular feedback from international advisory boards about, whether the competencies that are being explored and that graduates are coming out with are the correct competencies. There's flexibility here. And I guess what the 2020 standards does is it provides a real opportunity for schools to look at the competencies and then think, how is this best measured? Is it through direct or an indirect measure? Now, additional thing I'll say is, regardless of whether you choose direct or indirect measures, there still needs to be a regular pattern of measurement and actions linked to findings. So that process that both Venkat and Zara talked about, that you've got a very thorough process where you're gathering the data, you're looking at the outcomes, you're considering whether you need to make changes, you're processing those changes, and then you're looking to measure the impact of those changes. Whether it's direct or indirect, that goes. Yes, Ben?
Sorry, one question. Is the use of direct measure of assessment sufficient, or is the use of indirect measure a requirement for all schools now also? Question from Linda.
Great question. So what I would say is, this is where you've got more flexibility. So you've got to look and see whether the competencies you have in place, whether you're happy that they're well served by direct measures, or whether you would really expect to see some indirect measures. And bluntly, I would say if you've done that exercise and you genuinely believe that direct measures are the best way forward, then that's fine. But if it's a shortcut to not wanting to do the exercise of consideration, then it's open to challenge. I think you need to show that you've considered why direct measures are the most important. And if they are, that's perfect. But if not, that you've made an effort to change.
Yep.
And I don't know whether when we come to the end, I don't know if Venkat or Zara might want to pick up on that point afterwards as well.
Dora is asking on what you just said. Is there guidance in terms of the weighting between direct and indirect measure used in each program/course?
No. And again, this is where we're getting back to principles-based standard. AACSB doesn't have a specific guide. All it expects is that schools decide what is the most appropriate and they use that. And I think, to be fair, I think they would expect to see a mix of direct and indirect depending on the competency and what it is you're looking to measure. So I think the only expectation is probably that there's a mix, unless you really truly believe that there isn't a need for a mix because what you have is appropriate. So again, we're getting away from these compliance focus, getting away from that sense of rules based that we had, whether correctly or incorrectly, that perception under 2013. 2020 is really kind of moving into putting it back to school, saying, you tell us what's appropriate and you show us why, and that's fine. So schools have much more flexibility than they might have had. The last area I want to cover here is about the talk that's been around leveraging national and regional accreditation systems. And again, this is an area that's in real danger of being misunderstood. And there's two sides to this. In the first instance, you've got the fact that schools under the 2013 standards have always leveraged work and efforts that they've done for their regional or their national accreditation, where they feel that there's an overlap between regional or national accreditation and AACSB. They've used some of the material that they've done for regional or national, and they've leveraged that for AACSB, probably built on it. And AACSB has always said that that's appropriate. They've said that, schools that are subject to formalized regulations or quality assessment that's consistent with AACSB could use that to help evidence assurance of learning. However, under the 2020 standards, they've actually expanded some of the guidance, and they've also introduced something slightly new. So the first thing they've done in 2020 standards is they've laid out what are the essential elements of an AOL system. And this is in the interpretive guidance. It's not in the standards document, it's in the interpretive guidance document on pages 29 and 30. And it's saying, as always, if schools want to leverage, you know, their systems and use them as a basis for AOL, but they probably might need to build on top or to maybe nuance them slightly, that's absolutely fine. And that's the way it's always been. What they're also saying is that in theory, schools could now substitute evidence of alignment with national or regional accreditation as their evidence of AOL. Now, there is a massive however here. This is very new. There is no school or nation that currently has this in place. In most cases, to be honest, the national systems don't include all of the essential elements that are listed. So for example, if you take, you know, one system that I would be quite familiar with is the QAA system within the UK, and similar to the QQI system within Ireland. Both of those would be very robust, very detailed quality assurance systems and returns that have to be made to the national regulator. However, if you look at the QAA system, it has a really strong module or course focus. And one of the essential elements of AOL is that it is focused at program level, at degree level. And therefore, those two systems are not aligned, because one is focused very much at courses or modules, and one is focused at program. That's not to say that you can't leverage material within your the QAA system if you're in the UK to help towards AOL, but it's not going to be a direct substitution. And if any school thinks that its national system might provide a formal, you know, substitution possibility, it would be important to probably talk to other people within your region, within your area, to come together and then to approach AACSB formally to say, look, we think that there's a large degree of overlap between our national system or our regional system and AOL. We think that our national or regional system meets all of the essential elements of AOL. So we would like you to investigate, or we would like to investigate whether we could use our national system as some form of substitute for AOL. And at that point, AACSB would have to agree to take that on, to complete a mapping exercise, some formalities, and to research whether it's possible. So it doesn't exist yet anywhere. And to my knowledge, certainly within the last month, no region has approached AACSB to start that process yet. Now, there are agreements that have been talked about in the media around the NVAO in the Netherlands, around agreements with the UAE, with the Council with the UAE and the Emirates. But these are not the same thing. These are different things. So it's important to recognize that whilst the possibility is there, there are limitations, and it's important to be crystal clear on the essential elements of AOL. So very broadly, just before we wrap up for questions, and we take questions, what are the things to take away? So the first thing, as I said, much of the 2013 guidance remains. More things have remained the same than have changed. The key point is really to use this as an opportunity for standing back and for thinking about whether the competencies you have are the ones that you want, and whether your process that you have in place for AOL and for general quality assurance remains fit for purpose. And of course, remember that degree education requires a much more stringent level of AOL process than the more general quality assurance that's required for non-degree and executive education. And as I said, the transition to competencies and the focus on indirect measures provides an opportunity for you to kind of sit back and review and reflect on whether what you have in place, you know, reflects your mission and your strategy and what you want to achieve. And then finally, just to say, as always, there's lots of support available, I've mentioned the interpretive guidance, and there's some really good things in there in relation to Standard 5. That's the document with the green cover. The actual standards has a white cover. AACSB is putting on its own, obviously, seminars and conference sessions. AACSB also has a series of free webinars over, I think it's the next 3 Thursdays actually, but the next 3 weeks anyway in November. They've got a series of webinars. They're free to sign up for. And if you're not available to attend, you can register just to receive the recording. So I would encourage everyone to register for those. And of course, you've got your AACSB liaison, your mentor, externals, advisors if you have them in place, and you can always reach out to any of us here. So that's it. Thank you very much as always. And Ben, I'm anticipating questions, so we shall hand back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Joanne. I'll ask the first question from Jerry because it's related to the leveraging national system. And I think Venkat and Sarah, you have something to say. So Jerry is asking, does this work the other way around? Have any schools used their AACSB accredited system to successfully demonstrate compliance to a national system? So Venkat, do you want to start maybe?
Sure, yeah, because the AACSB process is far more rigorous than if you take the Australian qualifications framework, where we have the higher education standards framework. We certainly have used AACSB process to satisfy the requirements for the higher education standards framework. If you look at the other way around, which Joanne has been talking for a while about, be very, very careful and investigate whether it will be applicable. If you take ours, certainly our higher education standards framework talks about the importance of competencies, the importance of mapping those competencies towards the curriculum, but then it jumps on to the achievement of the learning outcomes. The in-between process of those deciding on the measures, collecting the data, analyzing the data, figuring out the interventions, and determining whether those interventions are effective, those parts, there are no guidance on that. So I completely agree with Joanne in terms of being very, very careful to investigate what is there in your national accreditation systems before you go on to matching with the AACSB standard.
Sarah?
In our case in Colombia, so at the moment we are transitioning for new regulations. So we are going to see how the Colombian government is requiring competencies mapping, but it happens the same there in Australia. We don't have a guidance on how to make sure that the process happens. So we are expecting that if the government is going to do that, but we already have in place our AO system. So what we have done for the programs that have been reaccredited or complying with that national regulations, we have shown our process, our AO process as it has been done, and as the government hasn't said anything very particular on that. The peer review team on those reviews, they just make comments on that, but they don't have a guidance. So you need to be very careful on how you show it, but it doesn't mean that it requires with the national accreditation. So
thank you, Sarah. One question from Angela is, does competencies replace learning goals and objective, or it is the umbrella for the later?
Do you want me to take it, or does Venkat or Sarah want to jump in?
No, I was about to tell Joanne, go for it.
So what they're saying is competencies is the broad name, as we said, for the knowledge, the skills, and the abilities. AACSB has said that schools are free to either work objective style language into their competencies, or to have a set of competencies a set of objectives beneath the overall competency. And that's very much up to schools. Where you do put objectives in as a kind of sub-level to the competencies, I think they would only expect to see between 1 and 3. They don't expect to see a whole detailed list. You want to keep your competencies at a reasonable level and to really focus on what are the big things. They may not be the only things that you want your students to go away with, but they're the ones that you don't want them to leave without, put it that way.
Thank you, Joanne. One question from Stephanie, referring to the comment on student feedback, I understood that student satisfaction survey could not just be their view of the course, must include a focus on competencies to count.
And that is why you have the combination of direct and indirect measures. And therefore, you can present a stronger case. So as Joanne was saying, it's best to combine both where appropriate. Yeah. In some instances, you might find that direct measures are not available or appropriate. In which case there is provision in the 2020 standards for the use of those indirect measures. But where applicable, use both.
Thank you. Question from Sally. So do competencies replace goals and we still have learning objectives?
Okay, maybe I can reiterate what Joanne was saying. You know, the key thing, what we are trying to say, according to the AACSB 2020 standards, is that your competencies cannot just constitute only knowledge, right? It has to consist of skills and other behaviors and abilities that you want your graduates to have at the end of the day. So have a reasonable number of competencies so that you are able to measure. Whether you have it as a broader competencies and specific objectives underneath, those are left to the individual schools to think about. The key is have a measurable number of competencies that consist of knowledge, skills, and abilities.
Thank you, Venkat. Stephanie is asking another question from the previous one on student feedback. And she's saying you could ask a student if they felt they had achieved the competencies.
I think that's a great answer. I mean, it would be part of the measure, certainly. Yeah. It might not be your only measure, but self-reflection and self-assessment could certainly be part of that. I think that's a great suggestion.
Yeah, we actually have done it for our master's students. So they have the rubric, but the professor also have he also has the activity that he evaluated, and the student also makes self-assessment. So and they talk about that performance. So I think it's a very good practice that you can do. But I don't know, I'm not sure if it is sustainable for all the programs, but it can happen with some cases.
It might be more appropriate even for certain types of competencies. For example, if it is something to do with teamwork skills, right? You certainly want some peer assessments to be going on. You want some self-reflections to happen, and you want your instructors to make certain judgments on the effectiveness of the team skills. So here you have a combo deal. There is a self-reported measure, there is a reflective individual measure, and there is also a judgment being made by the instructor. Makes a stronger case.
I mean, it comes back to principles, and it comes back to flexibility, and it comes back to each school deciding what is it for that school and for that competency in the way your school means it, in line with your mission and strategy, that matters most. And have your students, are your programs, delivering on that? So are your students leaving with those required things? So it's whatever you think works is the right answer.
Question linked by Jerry is, are new entrant competence levels ever measured in order to establish a datum point for objective value added measures by the end of a program?
I'll take the response to that one, and then the others can jump in. I've seen quite a number of schools do that. It's not necessarily part of their AOL, because for AOL, what you're looking to do is to say, here's a competency. Are the students leaving with that competency? Does the program deliver that competency? So you're really focused on what the end game is, you know, when you think that competency has been achieved. Many schools do have a system of taking an initial data point more for their own internal process to see whether they're making a difference along the way. Because if you take an MBA, and off the top of my head, if you're looking at something like written competency as one of your key program objectives for an MBA, you may have people coming onto the MBA who already score very highly on that, and then others who don't. But so long as they're leaving with it and your program has done its job, I think that's probably okay. So again, I would see it as useful, but not necessarily essentially part of the AOL. Sorry, I'm rambling a little bit there, so maybe somebody else could be a tad more coherent.
One of the things that I can add to what Joanne has said is, let's say that your cohort is always achieving or exceeding expectations. So you then have to go back and ask yourself, is it really because your students are performing brilliantly, or is it because you have not set the standard so high? So maybe as part of the continuous improvement, the kind of threshold that you set for them to meet or even exceed expectations, you can increase it. So again, it is principles based. You start at some point in time, you assess the level of competencies. If they consistently come as high, the next time you increase the threshold itself. So that's another way of looking at it.
Better answer than I gave. Thanks, Venkat.
I agree with you all about it.
Oh, thank you, guys. One question, could you go over the AOL process again for certificates, both standalone certificates and stackable certificates that result in a degree? Our university offers several graduate certificates, and we are implementing a stackable certificate degree this year.
Joanne, or is it?
Venkat, do you want to take it, or do you want me to jump in?
Very, very briefly. I mean, if all you're offering is micro credentials, then as what Joanne was saying earlier, you need a QA process. But if all of these credentials stack onto a degree program, then you need a full-fledged AOL process. I don't know whether that answered your question, but Joanne can expand on that.
The only thing I would add is, because I actually wrote it into my copy of the standards based on another session I was at back when Stephanie or one of the other AACSB team was talking, and I changed the wording to could. So if the micro credentials could be stacked, then it becomes AOL required.
I'm going to mix two questions into one to make it easier. Do you recommend to measure at the end of the program, final semester, rather than to measure in the first or second semester? And do you recommend to measure mostly the senior students, meaning at the end of the program? The two are really linked.
I think in any curriculum map, so as to speak, you need some sort of a map, a visual tool, where you identify where students' competencies are being taught, developed, practiced, and being demonstrated. And it's very logical that you would expect your students to demonstrate those competencies towards the end of a program, right? So there's no harm collecting the data earlier as part of diagnosis, and they could provide feedback to a senior academic who is going to be teaching, let's say, a capstone unit or a subject, to say, these are the kinds of competency gaps that this cohort is having, these are the spaces where they are doing well, and therefore you may want to focus on particular aspects of those as they move forward to demonstrating those skills. So such form of diagnostic data might help. But if you want to actually show where you've collected the AOL data, then it's typically towards the end of a program.
If I might just add an example as well, Venkat, sorry, just one example from a Spanish school that is actually one of the best ranked in Spain. What they did was to look at competency over time, and some of the competence were acquired during 4 years. So what they wanted to show to the students was to show every year where they were, if they were on track or if they were not on track toward acquiring those competence. So you also have this example of some schools that are really at a really granular level, that are looking semester per semester or year per year, where are the students in acquiring those competencies and skills.
That makes sense too. If you want to have a Cadillac model, go for it.
Yeah. I would just add that a key point here is the curriculum map. To have the curriculum map, then you can, as a school, make decisions on how to put the measures in a place where you can see how the student is actually doing with the process, and then reflect if you need to do it something backwards, or maybe you can just have some more have more data about diagnosis, or it's all about the mapping.
So one last question, because we're coming up to the end, but is there any guidance for general QA required for non-degree programs?
The standards include some general guidance. It hasn't really changed in 2013, but I think it's whatever metrics you have in place to know that the non-degree programs are successful. And I've seen schools use everything from, consulting with industries about particular programs, client satisfaction surveys, follow-up surveys, repeat business, because to be honest, if you're not doing it well, you're not going to get repeat business. So I've seen them use all those kind of areas to kind of evidence impact and to evidence quality. And then but a lot of it tends to, in my experience, tends to revolve around surveys of participants.
The only thing that I would add to Joanne is, if people are going to articulate from non-degree programs to degree programs eventually, you may want to think about, your credit transfer arrangements, whether those are of high rigor, right? So you may want to benchmark that with perhaps, like-minded business schools, and see if the academic standards are high enough.
So Venkat, I think your light is saying it all. Thank you so much for your time, Joanne, Venkat, Sarah. Sarah, have a lovely day. Venkat, welcome to the future, because you're on the 30th of October. So thank you so much. Have a great night. Thank you for the participants. If you have any questions, please feel free, and I will pass them on to the different panelists. Thank you again for your time. Stay safe, and speak to you soon.
Thank you.
A pleasure.
And thanks for everybody who's stuck with us over 3 episodes.
Okay.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.